Brother Jahan.
Brother Terry.
How are we?
Here we are again. Yeah, good.
We're episode 2 of Mission Methuselah, cracking along.
Mm-hmm.
For anyone who missed it, our first episode covers an introduction from us and also fasting and the benefits associated with that. And today we've decided to tackle the quite dense topic of metformin.
Indeed. I think it flows pretty naturally from fasting for some reasons that we'll probably get into. But there are a lot of pathways, a lot of cellular pathways and physiological pathways that they overlap on in many ways.
Definitely. And so metformin is this huge sort of exciting frontier in the sphere of biology of aging. It's got a lot of great things going for it. It's got some interesting hiccups that it seems to be throwing out there along the way, but it's definitely an area to keep your eye on if you're interested in this particular space, which if you're watching this podcast, we can safely assume you are. When's the first time you remember interacting with metformin in your space as a junior doctor?
As a junior doctor, look, I think whenever we start working in this field, even probably as a medical student, you see a lot of people are on metformin. And that's largely a side effect of the fact that a lot of people are diabetic. One of the main diseases of our Western societies. So that would probably be my first interaction with it. But it does have a very, very long history, metformin.
Tell us
an
more.
Interesting one.
Tell us more.
So when you start delving into the world of metformin, you learn some pretty interesting things. One interesting fact is that it comes from French lilac. So it's derived from this flower, a flower that was used throughout the Middle Ages, allegedly, in folk medicine traditions. Apparently treating some of the symptoms of diabetes like polyuria and polydipsia, so peeing a lot and drinking a lot. So that's an interesting aspect of metformin. Sort of analogous to another compound, berberine, which I don't know if you know much about berberine.
Yeah, a little bit. My father-in-law is a pretty keen interest in berberine and taking like a natural sort of approach.
I have some berberine in my cupboard, but I don't indulge in it very often. I think pharmaceutical grade things are probably a little bit better, but berberine's probably sits in a similar class in the sense that from Chinese medicine tradition instead of a folk tradition of the West, so it sort of sits in that similar, I don't know, old school.
I agree. These topics tend to get dichotomous really quickly. People are either really pro natural product or really pro pharmaceutical product, and there's normally people don't really see a connection between the two, and it's one of these sort of tribal aspects of being humans where it's an us versus them mentality. But I mean, I see it as sort of more of a progression from one to the other. We've just discussed where metformin has its origins in a French lilac. And so we should use that knowledge that is commonly found in natural medicines and Chinese medicine, things like that, as an area to say, we should look at this and see if we can do anything better with it.
Yeah.
And metformin is a really good example of how we've gone from that to a really efficient and ridiculously safe outcome of using a synthetic compound.
For sure.
And I think that people that are on metformin and there's so little side effects, it's a very big step to go from that from French lilac to that.
For sure. I think that's part of the again, this dichotomy you're talking about between like alternative medicine and medicine, and oftentimes the core difference between the two is science. One takes a rigorous sort of experimental approach to observations. You might observe that this particular plant seems to have this particular property, and how can we investigate this further? You might extract some of the compounds in that plant and do further analysis. You might then test that in a clinical setting and look for a real, true randomized effect. It harks back to a lot about what we were talking about yesterday, or well, not yesterday, but last time, when we were really we went into the weeds a little bit on scientific method and statistics and that sort of thing. But that's the big difference. And it's a powerful difference. It's why we're here today with a somewhat large life expectancy, I suppose.
Yeah, very much. And gives the confidence to the medical field to, you can widely prescribe this medication. You can give it out to people and know with a very sort of high confidence interval that this is going to help with your condition. And it's very unlikely that you'll have these reactions or these adverse effects. And that's as a result of all this data that we're basing our decisions on. Whereas natural products tend to have that area quite a bit lacking. There's not as much confidence to say, yep, I've only just met you, taken a 30-minute history and figured out what's going on with you medically wise. And I don't know what this natural product is going to do because we don't have the evidence. So
yeah, absolutely. And things like herbs and supplements as well that come from natural products can often contain a whole bunch of other active compounds. They're often not purified to the same degree. So, you could take like a wood bark extract and it's got like a whole bunch of different, polyphenols or crazy things in there. And that might be having interactions with other things. It becomes a lot more multivariate and complex.
Yeah, very true. Very quickly.
Yeah, very quickly. But yeah, metformin, French lilac, extracted and sort of tested, I think, around the 1920s, and used for a lot of things. And one of the interesting things I discovered and sort of delved into was its use in influenza early on in the day.
Yeah.
Pretty curious. And which has led to a bit of a resurgence now looking at the effect of metformin in COVID and acute respiratory distress syndrome from that particular disease.
Which speaks to the widespread nature of where metformin is acting in the body and how it's acting in the body. So primarily, as you pointed out with how you first interacted with it, metformin is first-line pharmaceutical management of type 2 diabetes. That's what's led to so much of these ancillary benefits or backup benefits, because there is such a large part of our population that has diabetes and is subsequently put on metformin with really good results. The patients that I can recall actually starting them on, which isn't really common in a hospital setting. Normally that's done out in the primary care setting. Very quickly you see really good results in terms of watching their sugars track throughout the day, and in extreme cases where they've been there for a long time, even their HbA1c, you can see changes there. But it's definitely a common drug. And now with this growing body of evidence where we've seen that cardiovascular disease outcomes are much improved when people are on metformin, has led researchers to sort of look at metformin and think, well, it looks like there's a lot more going on than just the treatment of diabetes when we're using this. And as you've mentioned, we can look at things like using it with the current pandemic. Yeah,
for sure. Pretty interesting. You mentioned cardiovascular disease. Another thing that it's been shown to do is reduce the burden of cancer. So people on metformin tend to have less, for matched controls, tend to have less incidence of cancers, which is interesting.
So when we make these big claims like you and I just have, where it's helpful in cardiovascular disease, it's helpful in cancer, the inevitable question is, well, how is it helpful in these areas? And what is the mechanism underlying? And I can remember going through medical school and I was always a little bit relieved when you were learning about a medication and when it came to the mechanism, the answer was, we're not really sure, because that meant that I wouldn't have to go too deep into the understanding that mechanism for that particular drug. It was a little bit of relief. Okay, well, if no one knows, but we know it's effective, I can just move on to the next thing. It was less study at a time in my life when study was quite a big workload. Paracetamol is another good example. So there's lots of good medications that wouldn't necessarily pass the stringent sort of standards that we have in place for proving why and how they do the things that they do. But metformin is a bit of a black box in that regard for a lot of different aspects as well.
For sure, yeah. I mean, we could probably go into a little bit of the mechanism of action now. Because whilst we do tend to gloss over it a little bit in medical school because it is not completely worked out. We do know some of the things that it does. Some of the things that it does are pretty damn interesting.
So what mechanisms come to mind in this sphere?
So there are two that I think are probably worth delving a little bit deeper into. One is inhibition of complex 1 of the electron transport chain. The other one would be activation of AMP kinase.
Yes.
AMPK.
So they're big.
AMP activated protein kinase.
Yes, yeah. So these are, we'll jump into a bit of the medical lingo going down this rabbit hole, but it's obviously very important to understand how this medication works. So broadly speaking, we're talking about an enzyme that's found within the cell. It's very, very important when it comes to metabolism and sort of energy transfer and balance. And metformin seems to be acting in this space. So if that's the sort of depth that you want to stop at, if you're a listener, then that's sort of the take-home message. But let's get into a little bit more detail.
Absolutely. And just to expand on that idea a little bit more, the electron transport chain, obviously hugely important for generating energy for the cell. And AMPK is a hugely important sensor or little intermediate molecule for measuring that energy balance in the cell, the energy state in the cell. So the fact that you're acting on both of those with one molecule is a pretty powerful thing.
Good bang for buck.
Yeah. And why that actually is a good effect is the next crazy question.
Yes.
So I suppose a good place to start would be AMP activated protein kinase, AMPK. And you can get a lot just from the name, I think. You have this molecule, AMP, that is activating this other molecule, which is a protein kinase. And AMP, we have to probably take another step back and talk about what the hell AMP is. Because AMP, adenosine monophosphate, is the burnt out part, the end product of ATP, which gets converted adenosine triphosphate, which is the energy currency of the cell. So all cells rely on having abundant ATP around to power all of the cellular machinery. And as ATP gets used, it gets converted from ATP to ADP to AMP, monophosphate. So it's losing these phosphates as it gets used up.
From tri to di to mono.
And so that gives you a little bit of a clue as to what AMP activated protein kinase is doing. It's looking in the cell and looking and seeing AMP is there, and AMP is activating it. So this balance between adenosine triphosphate and adenosine monophosphate, that ratio, as it skews towards AMP, you get more activation of AMPK.
So AMPK is like the empty light coming on in your car when it comes to petrol. The fuel tank's getting low. The sensor in your car picks that up and says, hey, you should probably get some petrol. When the ATP is a full fuel tank, we're getting down to low, we're getting a lot more AMP, and then we kick off with AMPK saying, hey, we should probably get some more fuel around here. And this
sort of gives you a clue as to what it might do in the cell. So if your energy balance is low, if your cellular energy balance is low, what you're going to want to try and boost that up. And some things you can do are absorb more glucose into the cell to provide energy. You can oxidize fatty acids to provide energy. And you can make ketones to provide energy. And all of these things happen when AMPK gets activated. And that's why it helps in diabetes. It sensitizes the cell to absorb glucose and take it out of the bloodstream.
The diabetes, these patients have high blood sugar floating around, or high sugar in their blood floating around their body. And the problem with diabetes, again, it's hard to condense it down to a clear sentence, but there's a problem with getting that glucose into the cell. And if we can tell the cell to be really sensitive about knowing when it needs glucose and getting that glucose into the cell, that's a good thing. And that's where the traditional use of metformin has come into play.
for sure.
Mm.
And so it's sitting at this really central mechanism of the cell, and measuring when our energy is low and regulating things to help deal with that. Other things that can do that help, it decreases cholesterol synthesis. The reason why it's going to do that is because cholesterol synthesis is really energy expensive. And if your energy levels are low, you don't want to be making cholesterol. You want to be relying on that from your diet or from other sources.
Yeah.
So that goes down. So you can imagine it's sort of improving. This is a pretty simplistic way of thinking about it, because cholesterol is not always, because lipidology, cholesterols, it's a whole other quagmire. But broadly speaking, you could maybe think of that as improving cardiovascular outcomes via that mechanism as well.
Yeah.
What else? mTOR.
mTOR is, again, this whole sphere in the biology of aging where it's a buzzword that you'll see all over the place. And sort of broadly speaking, would you say mTOR is good or bad when you're talking about aging?
Look, I think words like good or bad imply a moral characteristic. I want to avoid any sort of moral dimension to these questions, but I think broadly speaking, inhibiting mTOR has been shown to increase lifespan.
Yes, yeah. So we want less mTOR around. Not necessarily a good player.
Not necessarily. So AMPK acts on that mTOR pathway as well, and inhibits the activity of mTOR. And mTOR itself, there's multiple different complexes, mTOR1, mTOR2, but we won't necessarily go into that. We'll just say it downregulates mTOR and can promote a longevity phenotype through that mechanism as well. Yeah. Another really interesting thing is autophagy.
Yes, and mTOR has a role to play in that regard too. We touched basically on autophagy in the prior episode, where it's the idea of the cell sort of cleaning house. You have a very good etymological class upon autophagy from the Latin origin.
Yes. And how it does that is really through this cellular unit called the lysosome, which broadly speaking, you could think of as like a little bubble that has all these enzymes that break stuff down inside the bubble, and that bubble absorbs bits of the cell that it wants to break down. What's really interesting is both mTOR and AMPK have a hugely important effect in the lysosome, and regulating this autophagy process. So you activate AMPK, your cellular machinery, I'd have to double check whether it's what type of autophagy, but broadly speaking, autophagy gets upregulated to be more efficient with how it's using its protein components in the cell.
Yeah, that's right.
Because in an energy deprived state, you want to use everything you have really efficiently.
Yeah, the cell's scared, right? We're heading into winter, food is less available. We really have to be careful about what we're spending our energy on. So let's clean house, but let's make sure we do it in a very specific way, and that's a good thing for us. We like when that happens to ourselves.
Totally. So many interesting effects. Interestingly, exercise produces a sort of similar effect.
As well as fasting.
Yep. So both of these two tools in our toolkit for longevity, fasting and exercise, do act through an AMPK pathway. And AMPK signaling is hugely important in that. I guess the word is, I don't know, hugely important in exercise's effect on the body, converting exercise into improved mitochondrial function, all that kind of stuff. AMPK is important in that.
Hopefully we're painting a picture for people where these sort of mechanisms, where we know that exercise acts in this particular way and produces really good results, and fasting acts in this particular way and produces really good results, and that particular way involving AMPK and mTOR. So then when we come across something like metformin, seem to be able to correlate or directly see this effect of AMP and mTOR again, we kind of know that we're onto something good here. And this is the way science works, right? If you can find a mechanism, and the question becomes, okay, what else can we feed in at this end to get that same highway going in the body? So fasting gets that highway going. Exercise definitely gets that highway going. And then when we looked at metformin, oh, this looks like it's traveling along that same route. And there are obviously very, like a great deal of the population who will have an issue with fasting. So then this is important for those people. You know that exercise and metformin can be alternatives in that space. And maybe exercise becomes the issue, or maybe having metformin becomes an issue. And so you can chop and change, put these different controls in.
Yeah. I guess if we know metformin can have good benefits in disease, one question that still remains open is, can it have a good benefit in a healthy person?
Yes.
Or is it really only going to help in someone with a diseased phenotype?
Yeah. So again, we're looking at all these studies where we're examining people on metformin because they've got diabetes and they're on the correct medication for so, and we're starting to see a general trend with improvement in cancer and improvement in cardiovascular disease. But as you've just touched on now, we're just getting into the sharp point of the stick in that regard in the literature, where let's take healthy people, give them metformin and see what happens.
It's an open answer, and you and I are both fans of a gentleman out of the US called Nir Barzilai. He's a gentleman who's running, who's about to run a trial called the TAME Trial. Do you want to talk more about that?
So the TAME Trial is, the numbers I think was the most fascinating thing for me. The amount of people that they're recruiting in for this study, because it's quite easy to find through a few quick searches, metformin papers or studies where we're talking about a really low number of people. I'm going to mention some in this podcast today where it's roughly sort of 60 people with 20 in each sort of experimental arm. But the TAME Trial it's over 10,000, right? It's a huge. Do you know the numbers?
They are recruiting. I can't remember the numbers off the top of my head. One number I do remember is it's a $75 million trial. So I'm assuming there's going to be quite a few numbers.
Yeah.
I do know as well, unfortunately, it has been delayed, I think, from the COVID pandemic. So we have to wait a little bit on that. But big numbers, big trial. And it should hopefully be an interesting result. So just to quickly maybe give a bit more background. So TAME stands for Targeting Aging with Metformin.
Yes. Yep.
That's the little acronym. Every trial has to have a sexy acronym, and this one is TAME. They're recruiting healthy elderly and seeing what happens to healthy elderly who are, I'm assuming, metformin naive when you give them metformin, and seeing whether it improves outcomes. A very interesting and worthwhile question to answer. Is it a $75 million question? That's another question. But
the numbers I've just seen when I quickly searched was they've said over 3,000 individuals.
Okay.
Between the ages of 65 and 79.
Yeah. So that's pretty good. And to be honest, you could probably do it with less, but I think depending on what endpoints you're looking, obviously more is better. So it's really interesting. So you have an elderly cohort, and you're trying to see whether these people stay healthier longer with metformin. So it'll be super interesting to see whether metformin will be able to do this.
Yeah,
super interesting.
It's all the eyes are on this particular study, so to speak, in the sphere of aging, I think.
Yeah, in some way. I've heard some, or I know of some opinions who generally regard it as potentially like a bit of a waste of time. In the sense that, like, perhaps metformin might not be the huge effect size you want. So it's definitely tweaking a dial. It's definitely doing something. But is it going to be? It's not going to be the thing that keeps someone alive to 150 and really chipper.
Yeah, not the whole.
And so,
yeah.
No. So there are some critical voices, and if you are one of those critical voices, I think one thing to temper that would be to say that a trial like this at least opens up the space for large clinical trials targeting aging, which just actually hasn't been done before.
That's quite correct. And there's a few issues relating to that, right? Like the disease classification of aging as an actual disease. That's a very contentious argument being had in the literature and in the scientific world. Is aging a disease that we should look at treating like any other, or is aging, very much in the past? It's been looked at as a very natural process and something you shouldn't really intervene with. And it's quite well characterized in terms of what things will be going wrong as you age. And I remember, again, in med school going through this and just sort of looking at the summary and shaking my head saying, it looks like everything just goes wrong. I mean, pick it up and it's on the decline when you're talking about aging as a process. Which, again, if you get rid of your cultural influence or how you've been brought up to think about aging, if you said that to an alien lands and you're discussing what diseases are, and you're talking about this process where humans just seem to get old and then everything starts to go wrong. An alien would say, sounds much like a disease, what you've just told me a disease is. So I'm a fan of approaching aging as a disease. Because just that subtle shift in how you approach a problem tends to be a really big motivating factor. Humans do this all the time. Everyone does it in their day-to-day life. You trick yourself into thinking in a particular mindset, and that helps you achieve your goals. And I think switching from aging as a natural thing to aging really is meeting all the hallmarks of a disease. Let's treat it and see what we can do about it.
I couldn't agree more. Could not agree more. So, metformin, are you taking it? And if not, why not?
So, when we met on on our surgical rotation, we very quickly started to discuss metformin and its possible advantages. And I was and still am pretty convinced that it's a good idea. And I did manage to get my hands on some, but I'm yet to take it because as I reached a period with it, well, actually, before I go any further, some of the common side effects of metformin are very benign in nature, but having abdominal pain, nausea, and diarrhea tend to be the common side effects.
Yes.
There is a rare side effect, which is, again, a contentious issue of lactic acidosis. I did a Cochrane review in preparation for this podcast, looked at the Cochrane review, which is a body of scientific literature that tries to look across many, many studies and sort of come up with a concluding idea on that topic. And there's really not that great evidence for lactic acidosis being a side effect associated with metformin. It's a non-zero. It's not convincing,
but it's case report level.
Case report level. That's a good way of
putting
it out. So if you've got really bad kidneys, metformin is something to really think twice about. And obviously, whenever you do anything to do with medications, you should be consulting a physician or your GP. But my kidneys are great. I'm a healthy, young, fit individual. So I had no issues there. But around the time where I was setting up a good period for me to start taking metformin and see what sort of effect it was having, I then came across some more contentious literature, which describing the effects of exercise and metformin, which we talked about before. They operate on that same highway, but some of the more finer details on how they act on that pathway are sometimes competitive. So by exercising a lot, you could blunt that effect if you were taking metformin, which caused me to sort of pump the brakes a little bit because I exercise almost every day. I would say if I averaged out over a year, I would I'd be doing 6 days a week without breaking a sweat. So I do quite a lot of karate, quite a lot of gym work, mostly very aerobic in nature. Before the pandemic hit, I switched more to a lot more gym and anaerobic stuff now. But knowing that that was part of my lifestyle, I thought, okay, maybe metformin isn't the best thing for me. So I've got it, but I haven't started taking it. And that's where I'm sitting on metformin. But tell me about yourself. Metformin, have you got it? Are you using it?
Good question. So I have similar concerns to you on that front. I also do regular exercise. I might not be quite as consistent. And so from that perspective, I do have some metformin, and when I have been particularly lazy of a day, or of a couple of days, I will have some immediate release, usually about a gram, before bed, knowing that I'm resigning myself to the fact that I have not done any exercise and I'm tucking myself in. And so my rationale there being that I'm supplementing my lack of exercise with something that simulates it to some degree. I think if you're someone who does exercise literally every day, or even just really regularly, the benefit of metformin is certainly questionable from that perspective. It might be that in an older person who exercises regularly, because of their elderly physiology, metformin might still exert some positive effect. But certainly in a young person who exercises regularly, you're not going to get the same benefit from metformin as exercise.
So exercise, I like to think of exercise as being the premium fuel at a petrol station.
Definitely.
That's the premium, and metformin is questionably sort of the 91 octane or the sort of standard fuel. And I'm consistently putting in that premium unleaded. So okay, I'll stick with the gold standard. But if I enter a period of my life where I can't maintain that exercise regime, or there's extensive periods where I'll be too busy with work or something like that, then metformin, it's good to know that that's in my arsenal, that I can do that. And that sort of led me into the effective time when metformin is in your system. So is it reasonable to take metformin just on your rest day, the 1 day a week that I'll have off? Because we need to sort of be in this space a little bit longer and figure out at what time frame metformin would start to lose that opposite effect to exercise. And it may be just over the course of a 24-hour period. You mentioned that you're taking the immediate release version.
Yes.
Would have its effect and would lose its effect quickly as well. So I think that's probably the way to go in this space. There was an interesting few studies that I found on exercise and its effect, because we're talking about it, opposing exercise, but not in all of its end outcomes. So in this one study, they had a group of people exercising aerobically, so lots of cardio-based fitness. They were elderly, I think greater than 60 years old, and it was a mixed male-female, but mostly female. And the other group was doing the same exercise, but taking metformin as well. And across the board, things like your HbA1c, your marker of how much sugar is being found in red blood cells over a 3-month period, that dropped for both groups. So beneficial regardless of the effect of having metformin. So metformin works for a lot of these outcomes, but there's a few things like a VO2 max, which is a marker of, I mean, most people would think about it as a marker of your fitness. That seemed to be a deleterious effect when you're talking about metformin. But I would say the majority of things you measure are still improved with metformin. So it's not all bad news. And another study I looked at was resistance training versus aerobic training. Because of what we've briefly touched on before, the type of the electron transport chain, the type of energy system that the cell is using, which sort of that's where it butts heads a little bit with metformin when you're talking about aerobic exercise, but resistance training, so gym work, which is a whole host of anti-aging benefits in terms of bone structure and strength. There seem to be a much greater benefit when you're having metformin with aerobic exercise and metformin and resistance. The resistance had a much better effect. So it does come down to things like when you're taking metformin and what sort of exercise we're talking about. So realistically, in this COVID period where I'm doing a lot more home-based gym work, maybe metformin was the right idea in that regard.
Potentially. Again, you're sort of trying to build inferences off first principles about what we know about pathways. But, there are so many examples. I think science is probably littered with more examples of people doing an experiment, expecting a result and getting a different result. And then trying to figure out why. So we might hypothesize that metformin is best in this way, but maybe if you ran the experiment, you would find a contrary result, and then you'd have to try and rationalize why. But the best evidence so far sort of leans us towards this particular approach. So,
do you think? Do you think you'll change your metformin practices, or you seem to be happy with what you're doing right now?
I'm pretty happy with it. I mean, I don't take it that frequently. Just on the off days, just on the odd days. And again, I see it, someone might say, well, what the hell's the point of that? If, you're not taking it regularly, what benefit are you getting? But I do really see it as sort of tweaking a dial. Tweaking a dial. And, if over the course of a year, I've had intermittent usage, I've still had some usage over the year. And that's, maybe not a statistically significant effect, but I still think it would be some sort of effect, no matter what. But we shall see.
Yeah. And without getting too bogged down in the exercise space, we've talked about metformin being beneficial for cardiovascular outcomes, also anti-tumor effects or like anti-cancer effects that it has. So even having it sporadically, like you're mentioning, we know 100% that it's having these positive benefits in other areas, which all sort of coalesce into that the aging process, how widespread and effective it is. So I think it's, one, we know it's a very safe medication.
Yes.
And two, we know that it's definitely benefiting in a whole host of ways. The question it remains about the exercise, what sort of exercise is best to have if you're taking metformin, and how long to space out taking metformin and having your exercise, or even if it might be opposing, but maybe it's still above zero. So there's quote unquote no harm in taking metformin if you're exercising.
Look, some people do have side effects, like you mentioned, nausea, gastrointestinal upset, the biggest ones. Personally, I think if I haven't experienced that, I know if you're fasting, it might be of help to feel nauseous. I don't know. But, it's just one of those things you have to balance all those sort of things together.
And it tends to be a dose related response, right? In the patients that I've started metformin on, once we got up to the sort of 2 gram level, which is, broadly speaking, the maximum sort of dose that you want to look at, 2 grams a day, then some would report these gastrointestinal upsets or diarrhea. You drop it back down to 1 gram or 1.5 even, and those symptoms either become quite manageable or stop altogether. It's always nice when an intervention is dose adjustable like that, so you can you sort of find where that line is for that particular person, hit the sweet spot and stay there. The metformin is answering a lot of the problems that are normally associated with taking some sort of medication. It's ticking a lot of boxes. Very interesting.
It is. Yeah, for sure. I mentioned earlier on that there were some trials using it in COVID. Do you reckon it'd be worth talking about that a little bit?
Definitely.
So it's pretty interesting. So again, it's working through this AMPK pathway. but this time in the lungs. One of the culprits that people have been pointing to for causing the acute respiratory distress syndrome, which sends people to ICUs with COVID, has been angiotensin converting enzyme. So ACE levels in the lung.
Mm-hmm.
Where broadly speaking, increased ACE levels, I believe, were protective. And there are a number of reasons why that might be the case. But to sort of just give you the broad picture, AMPK activation seems to increase levels of ACE in the lungs, which is interesting. And so from that perspective, there's been some sort of weakish evidence hinting that metformin in people on metformin who subsequently get COVID are better off than people without metformin in certain populations. I mean, these are all, you know,
a lot of
all of these claims. All these claims come with significant asterisks, but that's what it seems like. And it's sort of interesting that it matches that early evidence in influenza as well, decreasing the severity of influenza.
It's a good real-time example of having a widely used medication that you're picking up some sort of secondary benefit from. So again, coronavirus obviously is plaguing the earth right now. It's touching every country. And all of a sudden you've got a lot of people on metformin, and you can notice a difference with these particular, which is how they first picked up the anti-cancer benefits and the cardiovascular benefits. And then the TAME trial can come through and show an anti-aging benefit broadly. And all-cause mortality, I look at that as the gold standard. Whenever you see all-cause mortality, so these people, I mean, less people died by getting hit by a truck when having metformin.
That's how magical it is.
That's the big bazooka term when it comes to literature. If you can say all-cause mortality is decreased, people die less by just taking this medication, then that's a fantastic day at the office.
It is. I think it's pretty interesting. You know, a lot of the anti-aging, in this space is sort of trying to retool existing medications for the purposes of longevity. And there are some really quite a few interesting examples of that. Obviously, rapamycin and the rapalogs are up there. Used clinically for immunosuppression in transplant patients, and also interestingly as the drug that is eluted in drug-eluting stents. Which is quite cool. So that's one that can be repurposed for anti-aging purposes. Others include ibuprofen has been found to have an interesting effect on increasing longevity through a weird mechanism as well. One that I hadn't thought of before. So that was really interesting to learn about. What other ones are there? There's a whole bunch, really.
Rapamycin is a super interesting one, isn't it? That's
a good one. Yeah.
Your island, isn't it? Am I thinking correctly? No,
you're right. Yeah. Rapa Nui. Rapa Nui Island. Easter Island.
Again, having its roots in sort of a natural plant-based environment, but as people sort of get to know my personality more through these podcasts, I'm a huge fan of finding those things in the environment or in the world, and then apply, the human scientific method to them and try to improve them, try to make them safer, more widespread, more available. We can't all be going to that particular island and scraping the right sort of plant to get the outcome. No. If we can take the good parts of that, mass produce them, give them to the public. Rapamycin's a little bit more dangerous in terms of hasn't got that same sort of safety profile when it comes to metformin.
I'd say it's got a bad rap, but I think it's just dangerous in the sense that most of the data we have for it is in doses designed for immunosuppression. And probably if all the trials were the doses necessary for longevity promoting effects, you'd probably say it's a pretty safe medication. Probably.
Yeah, whether or not you can put that into a healthy population, that's probably a little bit more of a stretch. But broadly speaking, rapamycin acts in the same way as AMPK, right? We're going to inhibit that mTOR complex.
Well, it's specifically targeting mTOR, and I believe mTOR complex 1. I have to double check. But I believe it's specifically targeting and inhibiting mTOR as opposed to operating through AMPK. So it's a much more directed therapy, whereas metformin sort of hits a molecule that has a wide number of effects. mTOR also actually has a huge number of effects, but it's much more targeted towards that specific nutrient sensing pathway. Because mTOR is less about energy balance like AMPK is, and more a nutrient sensing pathway.
Yeah. So you're getting more of a targeted effect with rapamycin, which is obviously a good approach to have, because then there's less adverse effects or less unintended secondary effects. That specific in your approach. I think it's worth mentioning things like sauna or heat therapy, heat stress. That tends to act in this same sort of, and obviously a few different ways technically, but in the same sort of sphere where we're talking about inducing autophagy and telling the cell to clean itself up. We're heading into that stark winter. We've got to be careful about what we're doing. And that's the sort of the good stress that you can put your cells through.
There are a number of heat shock proteins generated by heat shock, believe it or not, like a sauna, that act on the lysosome and change and modulate these, which again, mTOR and AMPK are acting at the lysosome as well, and changing how we deal with certain stresses, and autophagy being a big one.
Yeah, definitely. So we're looking at exercise and fasting still being really great gold standards to aim for, especially if you're in a similar age bracket to yourself and I. Many other comorbidities, nothing stopping you from achieving those gold standards of anti-aging effects of exercise and fasting. And then as we advance in the number of years we've been on this planet, not to say that we'll necessarily age if we keep doing these sorts of things, then metformin starts to become a little bit more applicable if you can't maintain the sort of fasting or high exercise demand. And things like a sauna, which is not only we being a scientific sort of podcast, we forget that sauna is just great, right?
Totally. It just feels good.
It feels great. It's relaxing. You can block out a whole bunch of time where you don't really have to think about anything else. And then to discover that it's activating these same sort of pathways as exercise, fasting, metformin, rapamycin, this is beautiful. This is great.
Oh, absolutely.
Combine the two, exercise and a sauna afterwards, and you have
the dream. That is the dream.
Are you a regular sauna user?
Look, I would if I could be, but Australia is not a big sauna culture. And so there's not really many publicly available. So I've looked around. We're in Geelong. I've looked around Geelong and I can't find any good public saunas available. I've looked into building one here, but I have a certain degree of space limitation, and I think I could fit like a little one-person sauna in somewhere. But that's a work in progress. It's a watch this space.
Yeah. My father-in-law has ordered one, and my sister-in-law and her husband they've bought one as well. I'm yet to use either of them. My wife and I and our daughter, we're moving next year, and I think as part of the new house, I think I'm going to buy an infrared sauna just for the plugging it into the wall. Certainly not a cheap item, but not an expensive item either. I think it's if you're talking about health, it's certainly worth it.
Yeah, I wonder about infrared saunas because the type of sauning I love to do is the dry sauna. It's the sort of 90 to 100 degree sort of temperature. Throw on some steam. It's just and I've done one infrared sauna, and I'll be honest, I was a little underwhelmed with the experience.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, just because they're using the claim is that this infrared energy is approximating the same thing, but you never really get up to that uncomfortable, like hugely uncomfortable temperature, where like you feel like everything's burning, and and that's the type of sauna that when I do sauna, that's the type of sauna I do.
You're an adrenaline junkie. You want to be pushed.
Well, I mean, I think you would understand that inclination as well as anybody, that, you know, if I'm going to do something, I'm going to do it like to the extreme. Yeah.
I haven't been in an infrared sauna, to be honest. That's why I think I'll spend the next.
I reckon before you purchase it, give it a crack, and maybe you'll love it. I personally just found it. It didn't just hit me over the head like I wanted it to. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Which is what that reaction is, what we need the body to go through, right? It's the exact same concept of exercise.
Yeah.
If you're exercising and it's always super easy and you're not challenged, then I don't think you're exercising, not to say correctly, but a good exercise is always challenging. You go to the gym, you want to lift a little bit heavier than what you did last time. Obviously, you can't do that every day, but the general trend needs to be upwards. And with my karate, like it's very repetitive. You know, I'm still working on the first punch I ever learned. Still drilling it. Still doing it 30 times every time I train. But it's about pushing, you know, really, really hard and getting the body to react to something and say, okay, I need to get stronger to get through this. And saunas obviously are doing that through these cellular pathways that we've mentioned. We need the cell to overreact and say, okay, I need to change something here. I need to go into my DNA and I need to make sure everything is correct. I've got no errors. I need to scan everything again. I need to make sure the telomeres are nice and long. That's another whole area we could probably do a podcast on.
Yeah. I've always been like fairly underwhelmed with telomeres as sort of a big important feature of aging.
They made a lot of noise when it was first sort of same with an antioxidant effect.
But it never made sense to me, like, why would telomeres on this cellular level cause organismal aging? I don't know. They're important, and probably the role where they're important is in senescence, more so than and you know, short telomeres running out, causing a cell to senesce or apoptose. But becoming senescent being a problem. So that's probably where telomeres fit in the story. But them in and of themselves. Having said that, lobsters are an example of a creature who essentially have unlimited access to telomerase, which is an enzyme which rebuilds the telomeres. And so they are creatures who, in theory, don't really age. Their cells have sort of unlimited life cycles. And the only reason lobsters do die in the end is because they get the energy required for them to molt their shells becomes too great, that they become slow and succumb to predation, which is such a weird thing.
Yeah, that could be
their proxy
future of the human race.
Maybe, but their proxy for aging is like a completely different mechanism in that sense. So they still.
Sorry, go
they
ahead.
still have it. Yeah, what I'm saying is they still have this sort of genetically encoded end point to their life, but it's completely different. Completely different.
And it's not that terribly slow process of that humans are used to, the gradual decline over time, and
which most organisms are used to. Really, most organisms, you take a dog, like every organism that we're sort of aware of, bar some freakish ones, you leave them be, and they all have this similar program. And I would go so far as to call it a program of decline after a certain point. And the fact that you can you can have this program gives me a certain degree of hope that we should be able to find ways to modify that program.
Patch it up and keep it going.
Whether that just means that we stay healthy and then die suddenly, or whether that means we just stay healthy forever, I don't know. But if there's a program, which I think there is, then we should be able to play with it.
Yeah, that's the concept of health span and lifespan, right? There's it's technically two different goals. Do we want to extend lifespan and accept the program as it is, and sort of be living to 200 and, you know, non-mobile, lose all our cognitive ability, be, you know, a very different type of existence? Or do we want a strong health span so we can be really healthy right up to an inevitable death or demise?
Yep, a precipitous decline.
I think senescence is probably a good idea to earmark that as our next podcast. What do you think?
Yeah, senescence is, man, we could have 10 podcasts on that easily. It's in my opinion, it's like probably one of the most critical mechanisms in this whole picture.
Okay, well, I reckon we wrap this up and we earmark senescence as something that we'll get to in the future.
All right, sounds good.
All right, thanks for your time, mate. Always good to see you.
See you, dude.